Well, here's the recorded version of the live presentation we did earlier of our Water Resources Outlook outlining the hurricane season for 2014. Well, here's an outline for today's briefing. We'll start off with the tropical season climatology, and then we'll have a little review of last year. Then we'll do a meteorological evaluation, a hydrologic evaluation. Then we'll listen to Chris talk about kind of where we are right now and what to expect early in the hurricane season. Then we'll have our tropical season 2014 outlook and the tropical season 2014 stream flow outlook. For those of you who don't know, this is who we are. We're the Southeast River Forecast Center. We're one of 13 river forecast centers across the country. But most of you, I'm assuming, know this. And if you don't know this, you'll have a link to our website at the end that you can get at and find out more information.
So here is the river flood climatology we always like to show you. And as far as the Southeast River flood events climatology, you can see we are in week 22, which is typically a quieter period as far as river flooding. And this summertime low pattern usually continues until early to mid-September when we get our secondary flood season from tropical weather and the wet season in the Florida Peninsula. And so when we look at the river flood climatology for Florida and Central Florida, we see a much different picture than the Southeast. We see river flooding ramps up beginning in early June and continues to increase through the tropical season for Central Florida. This is a combination of the tropics and the wet season convection that develops. So overall, our secondary flood season in the Southeast has much to do with the Florida river flooding, especially those smaller rivers in West Central Florida. So let's talk more on the tropics. So some may ask about how many tropical storms do we see each year that affect our overall rainfall and rivers here in the Southeast. And this chart gives us a historical perspective. And we see from 1950 to 2010, on average, it is generally about 1 to 4, with, I would say, an average probably close to 2 to 3 storms. So not many years with 5 or more storms affecting the Southeast region, not many years with 0. So overall, we anticipate we may deal with 2 to 3 tropical systems each year, producing heavy rainfall and flooding, maybe over a small area, but maybe over a large area of the Southeast.
So now that Jeff's talked about a little local climatology, I'll talk more on a broad scale of the climatology. And here we are looking at the Southeast, and for the Atlantic season, these tracks go back to 1851. And it just shows you that every place in the whole eastern seaboard has the potential of getting impacted by one of these storms, whether you be on the Gulf Coast or whether you'd be on the Atlantic coast. Now, for the continental United States strikes from 1950 to 2011, you can kind of see them bunched up in a couple of different areas. We'll start on the East Coast, and you can see from South Carolina, Hilton Head type area all the way up onto the Outer Banks that there are a lot of hurricane strikes in those areas. So that's one area. That you go further down the coast into Florida, a lot more down in South Florida and hurricane strikes in there. You go around on the western side of Florida and around the Big Bend area, and you get to the western Panhandle and Mobile, another area where you get more impacts from hurricanes, or you get eyes go over that portion of the coast, and then you go into the Louisiana and Mississippi area, another place where we tend to get more. Now, impacts can be all through. They can be big storms, they can be small storms, but as for where the eye goes over and where the actual track goes over, this is where they tend to go into. Now, as far as the climatology of the Southeast and the hurricanes, right now, at the beginning of the season, we'll look for development in the Gulf of Mexico or a little bit in the Caribbean. And as we move further into the season, we move further east, closer to Africa, as storms start to develop out there as we get into August and September. And then as we get into the October-November timeframe, it shrinks back into the Caribbean and the Southeast. Since we do have a bigger area for them to develop, the peak of our season runs right at about the middle of September, around September 10th. We usually see a ramp up somewhere in the middle of August, that August 15th time frame, all the way to that October 20th time frame, and that's kind of our peak time to see hurricanes. So let's go back to last year. Now, we didn't hear much about last year, and there's a reason. 2 hurricanes is the lowest in a season since 1982. Many of them stayed out in the Atlantic. A few got into the Gulf of Mexico, and as you can see, Tropical Storm Andrea is really the only one that impacted the southeast during that time. We really didn't have any significant weather from that. We had some rain from that, but we didn't have any significant storms that impacted the southeast during 2013. However, even though we didn't have impact from storms, we did get significant rain. We're going to look at each month during that time. Now, here's a look at June. These are departures from normal, and the purples and the blues show above normal. And as you can see, in Georgia, Alabama, Florida, all the way up into the Carolinas, we saw above normal precipitation during the month of June, yet only had the impact of 1 storm during that time. As for July, much of the same, although we didn't have a direct impact from a storm. We didn't have any storms develop, but we still were active. Pop-up type thunderstorms, areas where we had fronts occasionally come through. We had a lot of rain during that time, and that continued into the month of August, except as we look in probably South Florida and so forth, where we saw below normal precipitation. Now, that's probably more typical than what we've seen over the last few years. We got a little bit more precipitation, but we'd been used to we've been in drought so often, which we'll talk about in just a little bit, that we're not used to getting that kind of rainfall. However, when we got into the September time frame, now this is typically the time, if we don't see any tropical weather, we typically are very dry, and that was the case during this September. We didn't have any tropical activity, so most of the southeast stayed fairly dry. October was the same thing, where we had a couple of spots of weather. We had a couple of spots of normal in central Alabama and even in north Georgia, but for the most part, for most of the southeast, we were below normal during that time. And again, that goes back to not having any tropical weather during that time. So let's step back even a little bit further. On the right side shows May of 2012 and where we were with respect to the drought. And you can see that we were in exceptional drought in parts of the area. So going into the hurricane season that year, even though we expected above normal tropical systems, we weren't as worried because we had a lot more room to hold that water in the reservoirs, in local ponds and local lakes. So when we come into that, we don't worry quite as much. As opposed to last year, which is on the left-hand side, where we had very little drought. We'd come out of a wet spring and winter, and things were in shape, not in good shape, if we did see storms last year. So there was a concern as we went into hurricane season last year, because we were expecting an above normal amount of storms, and we were somewhat wet going into the season. Well, fortunately, we saw rainfall. We didn't see any tropical systems. We had flooding, but not significant flooding. Enough warm temperatures and evapotranspiration out of the soils kept us from having significant flooding during that time. So let's look at the drought monitor. Drought monitor goes back, this one is a histogram. It kind of goes back from 2001 or 2000 all the way to 2014, the current time. And as you can see, where we have the red areas, that's where we had significant droughts during that time. And between 2000 and 2003, we had a pretty significant drought. And then we had a little bit of a break between 2003 and 2006, where we were kind of in between. We had a little bit of time when we were in a drought, but it was a break. And then our next drought for the 2000s went from 2007 all the way to almost to 2010, 2009 really, because the fall of 2009 is when we saw some significant rainfall over the southeast, and things changed just a little bit. We had some flooding, and then again between 2011 and 2013, where we had some pretty significant droughts. But since that time, the beginning of 2013, things have been wet, and we haven't seen those things. So that's kind of leads us into where we are right now. So our 90-day departure from normal shows an area along the Gulf Coast and South Alabama and South Georgia that's been above normal during that time. Over most of the southeast, we've been near normal or above normal. The only exceptions to that are South Florida, the south third of Florida, and northern Alabama. Now that northern Alabama area is not in the southeast RFC area right now. That water flows to the west as it flows into the Mississippi River. That's a Tennessee River Valley and that area, and that water flows flows west. But it's possible that could creep into our area if that starts to dip a little further south. We'll just have to see. Now, the 30-day departure from normal is very similar to what we just saw, where the areas that are dry are South Florida, a little bit along the coast of North Carolina, but for the most part, it's very mixed. But for the most part, we're very near normal. Our drought indicators, this is our short-term drought indicator, and what it shows right now is over most of the southeast, we're either near normal or slightly above normal, with a couple of spots that are below. Western South Carolina, western North Carolina, South Florida, very similar to what we've been seeing in the previous graphics I've been showing you. Now the long-term drought, for years during the 2000s, this would all be red and it would take forever to get us out of it. Well, now we're looking at it the opposite way. We've had lots of rain over the last couple of years, and that's impacted the southeast a great deal. It's benefited our area. So it will still take some time for this long-term drought indicators to kind of go back to normal and maybe even get into drought. We'll just have to see, but right now it doesn't look like we're going to see that impacted. As for the Southeast Drought Monitor, where do we stand right now? Well, there's very little drought in the Southeast. So going into this hurricane season, we would be a lot more concerned, all depending on what our hurricane forecast is. And again, we'll talk about that in a little bit to see what that is. Our soil moisture anomaly, you can see over most of the southeast, we're above normal. And again, this kind of correlates with all the things that we've been looking at. We've had rain in those areas, and those areas show an abundance of soil moisture. And South Florida, northern Alabama, that's where we're not seeing as much moisture. So where does that put us as far as the stream flows? This is from the USGS, our partners, and as you can see, the green shows normal for this time of year. The light blue shows in the upper quarter, right just above normal, and the blue shows much above normal, with the black showing high for this time of year. In fact, a record, near record for this time of year. So again, most of the southeast is much above normal for this time of year.